Good afternoon, everyone. Oh, I feel like I'm at school. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's session. It's really good to have you all with me, and I'm sure we'll have a good time today working through what on earth conflict styles are and seeing if you are aware of yours and what other people's might be as well. So welcome. I'm just going to give people just a couple of minutes just to make sure that we have everyone before we begin. So feel free to just get settled, make sure you've got a drink available. You're not going to be here that long, so don't worry too much if you haven't. Thank you all for joining. I'm seeing a lovely list of names here. Okay, we'll just give it just a few more seconds and then we'll get into it. So just as we're preparing and just making sure that people have just one more minute maybe to get into the room. If you have any questions as I go along today, I may answer them as I go throughout the presentation, but feel free to put them in the chat. Feel free to put them in the Q&A section as well. And there should be a button at the top of your screen for either the chat or the Q&A. Feel free to do that. We might use the chat a little bit today, so feel free to take advantage of the chat function for either a question or just responding to anything that I'm saying. Feel free to do that. Obviously, I'll try and keep an eye on what's happening with the chat and the Q&As, but we'll probably get to most of the questions at the very end, unless it's something that I can quickly read and quickly respond to as we go throughout today's lunch and learn. All right, let's begin, shall we? Let's begin. Right, I'm going to present the slideshow now, so we'll just make sure that that is doing its thing. Hopefully you can all see that okay. Let me make sure I can see the chat as well. Okay, let's begin. So firstly, welcome to today's talk. The silence or the storm is what I've kind of coined it. So we're talking about conflict styles for you to understand potentially what yours might be and how you might be able to adapt that. So I'm Emma. I'm one of the associates with ADR Mediation Training. I'm a mediator. I do workplace and SEND disputes, and I am a conflict coach and an assertiveness coach. I do a lot of training around interpersonal skills and conflict management, and I'm also an accredited DISC practitioner as well. And the aim really for today's session is to see if there's a way for you to understand perhaps how you might automatically respond to conflict, and therefore also be aware of how other people might respond or react to conflict, and see if there's a way to adapt to make sure that that interaction is as positive and as peaceful as possible, communicating more effectively and therefore reducing unnecessary friction that might come up. So my first question for you, and feel free to use the chat function for this. How do you see conflict? I'm really interested in knowing that from your perspective. I'm sure that we're going to have people from different roles on this call today. Some of you may be mediators, some of you may be practitioners that are dealing with conflict in your everyday life and your job role. So I'm really interested to see what your responses are to that. And if I can't see it at the moment, that may be because you're not responding. It may be because I just can't see it. But I'm interested to know, do you see conflict as a sign of a problem? Do you see conflict as being entirely a destructive thing that's just very damaging on all sides? Do you see conflict as being part of the job, or are you entirely unbothered by conflict at all? I'm interested to know what your thoughts are on that. And if you have replied, there we go. Not entirely distractive, but personally struggle with dealing with conflict. Yeah, I think that is very, very common, is that we are sometimes okay with conflict in some situations, and sometimes there are just certain zones or certain relationships. Yeah, Tanya is saying a similar thing. Depends on the type of conflict, I'm guessing. Yeah. Misunderstandings. Yeah. Opposing views, part of everyone's day-to-day, can be healthy, depends on how it manifests. Yeah, we're having a really nice blend of answers here. Thank you all for your honesty as well. Yeah, who you are with conflict with can make a difference as to how you see conflict. Sometimes it's annoying as it can feel unnecessary. Yes, and often actually I quite like coining the phrase unnecessary conflict, rather than seeing conflict entirely as a big issue. Thank you all, and keep putting information into the chat as well. I appreciate that. Okay, I often like to see conflict as not a problem as such to be solved, but a dynamic to be managed. As a few of you have already said, conflict happens, right? And Max Lucado has this really good quote that I love, which is, conflict is inevitable, but combat is optional. And I think that is often the case in many of the situations that I come across where conflict has happened, and as such, it is just a difference that has escalated, and perhaps there's been something that other people have seen that might make them feel there's a risk to what's happening. But actually, it's the combat element that doesn't have to be the case when there are differences happening, when there's a conflict of interests, a conflict of opinions, perhaps. But it's important to be aware of how you see conflict, because that will impact how you're likely to respond or react to it. For example, if you see conflict as a problem, then you're likely to see it as something that's negative. Perhaps if it comes up, you might see it as a failure on your part, or perhaps something that you just need to avoid at all costs. Perhaps in the organization you're part of, conflict is seen as a failure. And so therefore, it's very difficult to work through conflict in a healthy way if it's seen that way by your organization. But if you see conflict as a dynamic to manage between people, then I think that offers a bit more of a neutral framing of it. It's workable, therefore. It's not personal. There's no shame to be attached to conflict happening. And how do you see the world? Do we have some people watchers in the room? I'm sure we do. If you have come to this Lunch and Learn, I'm sure you are interested in people. I'm definitely a people watcher on the train, in a cafe, out shopping. I'm always fascinated by what's happening with people. Why are they here? What's their relationship? There's a really lovely word, sonder, which I really like when I discovered it. So to sonder is having this realization that each passerby has a life as vivid and complex as your own. And I really love that. And I think for many of us people watchers that potentially in the room, you relate to that feeling of what on earth is happening in that person's life. And the thing is that we're actually probably less than 10% aware of what other people have going on in their lives or have experienced throughout their lives, including those people that we interact with on a regular basis, whether that's a colleague, whether that's a client, whether that's someone who you just have to deal with as it's part of your job or one of your family members. You may not be aware of much more than 10% of what's happening for them. And what that means on the flip side as well is that they're only aware of probably 10% of what's happening for you and what's gone on in your life. And the things that you're unaware of and the things that other people can only assume about you and draw conclusions on based on, you can do that based on what they see and their interpretation of that. And likewise for you, we only draw conclusions based on what we see from other people and our interpretation of what's happening for them. But how you see the world is significant, because it influences how we show up in a conflict situation. Now, before there were influences talking about beauty and travel and relationships and protein or cleaning your house, Before all of those influences, there were conflict influences and still are. So we have these different factors that influence our response or reaction to conflict. The same for us as for other people. How we might communicate, what our frames of reference are, how we see the power dynamic, and of course, the key thing that we're talking about today, conflict styles. Ooh, let me get you back to that. So first of all, as a DISC practitioner, obviously this is the one that I go to the most, but I do use the same colours as Discovery Insights, if you're aware of that as well. But the same for Myers-Briggs, or some people refer to it as MBTI. There is often a kind of common understanding about having groupings of traits that you often see with people. If someone's likely to have this particular trait, they're also likely to have these other traits. And I don't see them as personality profiles as such, but just a way of understanding people's communication traits, what motivates them, and the kind of environment they're likely to thrive in, and how they process information. That's how I see them. Just as an example with DISC, because that's the one I know the most, you see here that you've got these 4 quadrants that people might fit into, and they tend to have a bit of a blend of different ones as well. But if we were just sticking to the core 4 styles, we've got the D style, where the focus is on speed and being task focused and goal oriented. You'll often see them be like the daring person. They're very direct with their language, very driven towards that goal. Or the I style, very people focused in a sociable sense. They really want to have a good time. They're light-hearted. They often see the silver lining to everything, and they always want to start a new thing. They want to do a new hobby. They want to create a new project. They like to use their imagination and like to influence people in a positive way and be influenced in a positive way. And then we have the S style, where the focus really is on seeking calm in all areas of their life, whether that's with their relationship, their work. So with that comes this idea of wanting to be very focused on the routine and not really enjoying change very much, not really enjoying anything which might feel like a threat to calm and having steadiness in their relationships. And then we have the C style, where they're focused on the detail. They really want to make sure that when they achieve a task, it's not about speed, unlike the D style, but actually it's more about the quality of the task and the outcome of it. And they tend to be more risk preventers than anything else. So they tend to be a bit more cautious, very conscientious, and like consistency. So that's just one element, one influencer on how conflict might manifest itself between different people. If you can imagine someone who's focused on getting a task done really quickly, and then they're paired with someone who wants to just make sure that everyone is okay, everyone's calm, and let's stick with what we know, then you can imagine that there might be some friction that comes up there. Now, it's not an automatic that those differences are going to become problems, because the same could occur with 2 of the same style, with just approaching things in different ways. However, those natural friction points might happen there. And I often use communication styles like DISC as one of the points of conversation during particularly a workplace mediation, because so often it's not about people being nasty. It's not about people being baddies or goodies or anything like that, but actually so often in conflict, it's about having very different ways of communicating and taking the other person's form of communicating that's different to yours in a way that feels very personal. So that's one influencer, communication styles. The next one, frames of reference. As you can see here, there's a picture where someone's just holding up a tiny slither of a mirror, their own experience that they see the world through. And when you're thinking about a frame of reference, you're thinking about what has happened in someone's life to contribute to how they now see the world. What experiences do they have of school? What job roles have they gone through? What was their household like growing up? What values did that bring into them? What kind of relationships have they had as a child, as an adult? What experiences at school with relationships? Were they bullied? Were they the bully? Were they just kind of on the edge of things or not really aware of what's going on at all? What perceptions do they have of the world? And it's worth thinking about this from your perspective as well. What are your frames of reference? What are those things in your life that contribute to how you show up and how you respond to a situation of conflict? If you think about someone showing up to a situation of conflict who's been through a very, very difficult time as a child, where the type of conflict was very destructive, where there was a lot of shouting in the household, where there was perhaps things even beyond that that were really quite harmful to them, how might they see conflict in a different way to someone who has not had that kind of experience? These frames of reference, as much as they don't dictate who we're going to be, they are an influencer in how we might show up and respond. In a similar way, power dynamics come into play so often in conflict, those competing interests. And if someone sees someone else to be in that position where they have more power to determine what happens in their life, then it's likely that they're going to see them as a bit more of a threat than someone who might not have that same power. So how might people see you when you show up to an interaction? Do they perhaps see you as a threat to their status, their relationships, their finances, or their living situation? And how do you perceive others when you go into that room, when you show up to a video call, when you're responding to a letter that you may have received, or an email, or on the phone? What do you see of them? What's your perception of the power that they have to potentially affect your life, or the agency that they have over their own life? If someone has had past experiences with authority that has not been very positive, then when they see someone else in that role, it may be that their response to you is not actually to you, but to the role that you hold, the position that you hold. And potentially their perception of threat because of the power that they might see that you have to impact their life in a positive or a negative way. And finally, we're talking about conflict styles. So let's look at the Thomas-Kilmann conflict model. Now, you may be familiar with this, particularly if we've got some other mediators in the room or other people who've gone through training on conflict management. You're likely to have seen this model. What you see here on the different axes is you've got one on the axis going up, you see the priority that someone might have in terms of the goal or the outcome that they're seeking. Sometimes they'll refer to this axis as being around the assertiveness level they have towards going after that goal. And then on the line at the bottom, that axis is about the priority that's put on the relationship. So as you can see here in the top left from what I can see, we've got at the highest point of the goal priority, but the lowest point of the relationship priority, we've got the competitive shark, where actually it's about winning the situation. They want to win the argument, and it doesn't matter about the relationship. The goal is the priority here. And then in the bottom right, where the relationship is the highest priority and the goal is at the lowest priority, we've got the accommodating teddy bear, where it's actually more of a lose-win, where they are losing out. And then the avoidant turtle, which is a bit of a lose-lose really on both the goal priority and the relationship priority. And the compromising fox in the middle is thinking about the middle ground, and the collaborative owl right at the top right. Now, in some situations, one of these styles might actually always be appropriate. For example, with the competitive shark, we might think of it as being a potentially a negative one, because they're the competitive, they want to win. But actually in an emergency, sometimes it's quite helpful to have someone there who is not distracted perhaps by what's happening with other people or the potential for their reputation to lose out. They just want to do the right thing. And so sometimes that can be a positive. But if you get into the habit of that, the potentially someone who becomes more of a competitive shark more than they need to be might end up applying that win-lose approach when actually it's not very helpful, and it can impact their relationships by focusing so much more on the goal than on the people that they actually care about. And with the accommodating teddy bear, there may be times when it's appropriate to put your desires beneath other people's, or because of the value of the relationship. I think about being a parent and how often you put the needs of your child above your own needs, and that is often very, very appropriate to do that. Or in another relationship where actually the goal is not incredibly significant, but the relationship is. So it's okay to take a step back in those situations. However, when you get into the pattern of being an accommodating teddy bear, it may be that you lose out on going after a goal that actually is important. It's important to you, but also it's sometimes actually important to the relationship that you're trying to protect in the first place. The accommodating teddy bear, as I'm sure you probably have gathered by now, are the people pleasers amongst us, of which I'm sure some of us can be at different times anyway. And then the avoidant turtle, there can be a positive to this, because sometimes the goal is kind of minor, the issue is minor, the relationship is not very significant, so therefore it's kind of, I'm not going to fight for something when it's not worth it. However, when it gets into a pattern of just not even bothering, sometimes that can show up in a pattern of being unhelpfully avoidant, when actually it will be beneficial to go after something, to protect the relationship, to go for that goal. And the compromising fox, often as a mediator, you get told about perhaps you're going after a compromise as a mediator, but typically, no, we're not aiming for a compromise, because that's a 50-50. It's a middle ground, which sometimes is what you have to land on if it's really, really difficult to go otherwise. But it's not fully satisfactory to both parties. So the aim really is for the collaborative out, the best outcome for all. So you're going after the goal and the relationships. It's a collaborative way of doing things, but in order to do that, there's a bit of time and trust required. So what about you? If you're being honest, what's your autopilot response to conflict? Do you bring the silence, or do you bring the storm? Have we got some competitive sharks in the room? Some accommodating teddy bears? Yeah. Have we got some avoidant turtles? Some compromising foxes, where actually let's just find the middle ground for everyone. But perhaps if there was a bit more time, you might be able to aim for the collaborative owl approach. Middle ground, yeah. Silence, yeah. I think it's really helpful to have some honesty and awareness. This whole talk is about honesty and raising self-awareness, so that you can also therefore be aware of what happens with other people. Yeah, compromising, middle ground, more towards the silence. Thank you all, and feel free to keep putting it on in the chat as well, depending on the situation. Teddy bear shaped shark. I like that one. I like that one. Teddy bear shaped shark. Yeah. Yeah. Sometimes we can appear very accommodating in order to win. Trying to fight on behalf of my others and the storm. If for myself, I am silence as an ADHD, RSD. Yeah. Okay. So rejection sensitivity disorder, for those who might not know that acronym. So worrying about setting others. Yeah, that feeling of potential rejection can be a really strong motivator for being the accommodating teddy bear, even if in the end it ends up not being so helpful. Yeah, thank you all. Thank you. You know, one of the things that I'm really interested in when understanding your own default mode is to kind of go underneath the surface and wonder why. What's underneath that automatic reaction? Is it partly to do with your communication style, with being a shark perhaps, where you're just naturally very task focused? Is it because of, in your frame of reference, there's a competitiveness there because when you were growing up, losing was the same as losing respect or status? Are you accommodating because assertiveness was viewed in a negative way in your household? Have you experienced a negative power dynamic? And so therefore there's a perceived risk when anyone else has more control or power than you based on those negative past experiences. I'm always interested in understanding what that might be. And it's helpful for us to perhaps question that in ourselves, what's happening here, but also wonder about that and be curious about that for others. And then determine whether the conflict mode that we default to is actually the one that's going to be the most beneficial, the most appropriate in the scenarios that we're in. And if not, how can you consciously shift towards another one? Again, going back to that quote, conflict is inevitable, but combat is optional. I would work through these steps. So first, you need to pause to be able to do this rather than react. So give yourself a chance to respond. So firstly, reframe your perspective. What are your thoughts about this? What are the feelings that are coming up? And what are their thoughts and what are their feelings about what's happening here? Is there a perceived risk? And if so, what can be done to reduce the perception of that threat or risk? What can be done to just lower that feeling of need to be an adversary in this situation, to defend? And then focus on the shared goals rather than thinking about the areas of division or the need to defend yourself against this person. Where is there any alignment of those interests or goals that you might have? Is there a way to creatively find the win-win, thinking outside of the box? And then valuing differences. You know, the phrase everyone is different rolls off the tongue, but actually differences can be unsettling. If someone emails in a different way to you, if someone wants tons of detail when you feel like you've given them enough, when someone is always looking for the silver lining, when they just need to be a bit more pragmatic, when someone dislikes change, if those things are not what you do, if that's different to you, then it can feel unsettling. And naturally, we can go to making it feel personal. So if we value the difference, we depersonalize the difference and reframe it in a completely different way. And finally, encourage dialogue. Oh, yes, what a surprise. A mediator wants people to communicate. What a surprise. But actually, listening lowers barriers. Understanding creates reassurance, and collaborative problem solving builds trust. So although all conflict styles have their place at times, the one that is generally going to be the most beneficial is to aim for the owl, collaboratively focusing on a win-win outcome. And that's done by being aware of the perspective that you bring to a situation and to conflict, having awareness of how the other person might show up to and what they bring with them, and working towards collaboration through conflict, not combat. As one of my favourite children's books says, I often like to apply this to conflict. So in We're Going on a Bear Hunt, it says, you can't go over it, you can't go under it, you have to go through it. So if we're going to go through it, we may as well do it in a peaceful and collaborative way. Thank you all for listening. I hope that has been helpful. It's just giving you a little bit of food for thought about what comes up in a conflict situation and how it might influence how you show up in conflict and how other people might show up in conflict as well, and how you can perhaps shift that in a more positive perspective. If you've got any questions in the last couple of minutes, then I'd love to answer them. And if you want to do any training on conflict management, on having those challenging conversations, then ADR Mediation Training offer a load of really great courses that you can take part in. Right, I'm going to stop sharing and have a little look at what we've got in the chat. Okay, so just looking at some of these questions here, if I find I'm able to manage the conflict of the situation, the struggle I face is the understanding and awareness of the other individual and a defiance from them to compromise, working in HR. Okay, do you have any suggestions on this? Okay, so I would say that when there is defiance, then that gives an impression to me that there is a lot of concern about needing to defend themselves. So I would be thinking about, how do I approach this situation so that I am less of a risk to them. Because defiance tends to be when they feel like they have to be against in order to protect themselves. So I would be wondering about what is their experience perhaps that I'm unaware of and may not be fully be able to be aware of, because they may not want to share that, and that's absolutely up to them. But perhaps how am I showing up in a way that just is those tiny little moments and behaviours that help them see me as less of a risk? That's what I'd be wondering about. Hopefully that's a bit of a helpful tip. But thank you for putting it there. Thank you. And thank you all for joining us. If you have any other questions that you want to shoot off to our team at ADR Mediation Training, then please do put them over to us. And great, I'm glad that answer was helpful. Thank you. All right, have a wonderful afternoon. Aim for the owl, everyone. Aim for the owl. Right, take care. Bye-bye.